It's July 24th, 2024, and this is William Michael, the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. This morning, I received an email from a friend of the Academy who had asked me if I was aware of some work being done by a leader of one of these classical Christian school movement programs, and of course, I said no. I don't track all of these things. I don't pay attention to the classical education movement and what it does, because I ultimately think it's just a waste of time. And as I started to respond, I realized that I don't know if I really communicate or have communicated what the fundamental problems are with the fake classical education movement that we see not only in Catholic circles but also in Protestant circles, because they all share the same error. It should be a red flag when you're a Catholic and you're promoting the same message in education that Protestants are promoting. That should be a red flag that something's wrong. But when you're not really concerned with having an authentically Catholic message or having a truly Catholic solution to a problem, when you're just trying to promote your own business or your own activity or sell your own resources, it doesn't really matter if there's some red flag waving in everyone's face, as long as the money's rolling in, and it certainly is rolling in for these groups. They can ignore that stuff. It's like Daffy Duck used to say, consequences, schmonsequences, as long as I'm rich. And this is what ultimately is going to cause this fake classical education movement to eventually disappear and become meaningless. So what I'd like to talk about today is what is actually needed when we talk about the reform of education. What is actually needed? Once we talk about what's actually needed, we'll see why really no one is going to be interested in that work. And also why Catholic and Christian parents and students are not going to be interested in that work. It's going to be like all true Christian things. It's going to be work that's for men and women and children who are influenced by God's grace to seek things that are true and good. It's not going to be attractive to the crowds. It's not going to be a source of business and profit and money making and luxurious modern culture and so on. It's going to be simple. It's going to be apostolic. It's going to be poor, and it's going to have heavenly reward attached to it, which is what motivates those who seek it. So let's talk about what the reform of education actually requires. And that will allow us to see that the fake classical education movement doesn't actually have reform of education in its sight. It really just has immediate profit in its sight. We'll see why the fake classical education movement will not reform education, and we'll see what needs to be done to actually reform it. But before we can get into that, where these discussions commonly fail, we have to identify what the actual problems are first. We have to identify the actual problems, because if we don't solve those problems, nothing is being reformed. If there's a cause of disease, and we're going to be good physicians, we've got to identify what the cause of disease is, and we've got to make sure that we remove that cause. So what is the actual problem in modern education? And I would like to propose that there are a number of different problems, but the most important problem is that the model of education that was developed in the 1800s by public schools in America, what we consider the grade level public school system, that was a model of education designed to serve government-funded schools for all citizens. It was a school model intended to serve very low objectives in education, because the public school mission really just had 2 or 3 objectives. One of the objectives was to Americanize all of the immigrant groups and communities that were pouring into America. They needed to be Americanized was the term. They need to be integrated into one common culture. They needed to be taught to think and act like Americans. And the only way that that could be done in some sort of systematic way was by compulsory education that trained all of these different groups of people, the melting pot, as it were, of American society, that trained them to become a common culture, to become Americans. And so that was the first objective of public education. People needed to learn how to live in a democratic society. People needed to learn how to live in a capitalistic society. Because the American culture was receiving millions of immigrants, and because American culture was completely unknown to those immigrants, it needed to be taught. They needed to be taught how to think and live like Americans. That was the purpose of public school education. The political commentator Ann Coulter recently said something that I found interesting. And I don't pay too much attention to political commentary, but and I'm not a fan or follower of this woman, but I just happened to catch a clip, and what she said was really significant. She said, every time someone comes into America from another country, America becomes less free. It's a really profound statement. American culture is free. We enjoy liberties in America that other countries can't even understand. And we take it for granted that when these people come from their culture into our culture, they're like automatically liberty-loving American people. And the truth is that they have never lived in a free society like ours. They don't understand how a free society works. They're not prepared to live in a free society. And so when someone comes from a less free society into America who doesn't understand how to live in a free society, doesn't understand how free society works, our free society comes one bit less free. That's the influence of immigration. And unless that influence is neutralized, all kinds of trouble will develop in America. Because we can have cultures come into America that look at it as a vacuum of power who seek to take control, and they'll do so by force, by violence, and so on. And so unless immigrants are Americanized, immigration is actually detrimental to the principles of American life. And so again, the public school was intended to Americanize immigrants. That was the first objective. Why it was a political movement. It was seen as necessary for the good of the American society. The second reason was because this was also the time when the public schools were being developed was also the time of the Industrial Revolution. And so there was this opportunity in America to industrialize. And you had men like Henry Ford a little later, but the ideas were already present. This idea of mass production, this industrial vision for how society would work, the formation of cities, the separation of the productive farmlands from these concentrated cities where all of the raw materials were turned into finished products and then distributed by means of train at that time all around the world. And you had this sort of, companies like Sears Roebuck as the model of these distribution companies. But in order for this industrialized society to work, in order for this idea to actually work, the American citizens had to be taught to become workers in such a culture. They had to be taught to become factory workers. They had to be taught the skills and the mindset and the discipline and the culture that was needed for, if you've watched It's a Wonderful Life, Mr. Potter talks about how his goal is to promote a thrifty working class. A thrifty working class. And Mr. Potter criticizes the Baileys and all of their attempts to give poor people, working class people, more comfortable lives by saying that it's going to turn them all into lazy rabble. And you see that this idea was that for American society, for this industrialized, capitalistic society developing in the late 19th century to really thrive and to make America wealthy and powerful, the working people needed to be trained and prepared for that life. And so this was a secondary objective of public schooling, to give them education sufficient for the workplace. So the Americanization of the people, to give them an education in citizenship, and to give them an education in workplace readiness. Those were the two principal objectives of the American public school system. So the curriculum of the schools, the design of the schools, the methods of teaching in the schools, the assessment standards in the schools, every aspect of school life was aligned with these novel objectives in education. The traditional objectives of education, which was to lead people like the Jesuits said in the Ratio Studiorum, the goal of a Jesuit school was to lead students to the knowledge and love of their Creator and Redeemer. Well, that was not the mission of the American public schools. And so everything was changed. Not just the content, not just the books, not just the teaching methods, but the entire structure of education was changed to serve these relatively simple objectives of public education. The source or the funding for these schools was not going to be private tuition. It was not going to be a school that had to be sustainable locally. There was no pressure on sustainability, no concern for money, as it were. Money was no object, because it was going to be funded through taxation. It was going to be publicly funded. And so it did not need to be efficient. It did not need to be sustainable in a private sense. And so the designers of the public school system weren't accountable to those sorts of questions. And they designed these massive public schools throughout America that had relatively low standards for outcomes, had unlimited supply of funds, and simply needed to Americanize and prepare for the workplace an immigrant, a diverse immigrant culture. That was the mission of the public schools. Now, that public school culture was dominated by Protestant religion. And so the public school, the early public school movement, became associated with Protestant religion. And that Protestant religion was sort of the religion of this new American society. This Protestant work ethic was necessary. It's sort of a secular, earthly-minded religion that's concerned with earthly prosperity. There's no religious vocations. There's no monks or nuns, no priesthood. We can't have any of that religious stuff. We can't have any allegiance to the Vatican in Rome when the whole mission of the school is to draw all attention to American life, to Americanize, and to make these individuals effective as cogs in the modern industrial machinery. And so Catholicism was seen as an enemy to this Americanization. It was an enemy to it because it called the attention of citizens to something that was higher, something that transcended American culture. And so it was seen as sort of a treachery or some kind of allegiance to an outside authority, to some foreign power. So Protestantism dominated this early public school system, that sort of mentality, Bible-based religion, the kind of stuff we read about in the founding documents, God being referred to in vague terms like nature's God or the Creator, and so on. That was the religion, just sort of a simple deism was the religion of the American public school system. And Catholic bishops were concerned about this because Catholic kids were being drawn into these schools. All of these Catholic immigrants from Italy and Ireland and so on were pouring into these cities as immigrants and then being, herded into these public schools. And the bishops said, we can't allow this because these schools are not neutral or innocent. These schools are actually anti-Catholic. And so we've got to provide Catholic education. And so what happened was, in the spirit of the age, Catholic schools were organized that imitated the public schools that were being developed. The way that the grade level schools were being developed by the public school system, Catholic schools were developed in the same way. And so we had this sort of parallel public and parochial school systems. The word parochial means parish. Public and parochial school systems that were similar in their model, they were similar in their structure, even similar in their objectives, because these American parochial schools were very focused on Americanization, just like the public schools. I have books from the Catholic school systems in the early 1900s where you can see the curriculum and the message and all of this like American patriotic education and so on that was in these early Catholic schools. But they were parallel systems, and it's important to understand that. They were parallel systems. The Catholic schools were made in the image of the public schools in America. Now, remember, there's tons of immigration, largely from Catholic countries. And so not only is there an influx of Catholic students coming into America, but there's also a flood of Catholic adults coming into America, and among these adults are priests and monks and nuns, brothers and sisters, missionaries, and so on, coming from European Catholic countries. So the Catholic school system was able, because of immigration, to draw religious communities devoted to teaching to staff these Catholic schools. And so these relatively large, relatively public Catholic schools could be organized with a grade level model, just like the public schools, and they could find teachers among all of these immigrant religious communities coming in from Catholic countries. And so as this developed, this parallel educational system was able to grow and grow rapidly. And as we consider that, again, so many of the immigrants were coming from Catholic countries, the population of these Catholic schools was great. The demand and interest in these Catholic schools was great. But even more than that, the bishops at the Baltimore Council said that Catholics were obligated to attend the Catholic schools. So you had a lot of things working together for the benefit of the Catholic schools, but it was very short-sighted. And when the immigration slowed, the Catholic school system died. When the immigration slowed, the Catholic school system was no longer sustainable, and it died. Now, when I say that it died, I don't mean that it disappeared, because it was maintained and perpetuated. But what made it effective in its early years was lost. That flood of European Catholic brothers and sisters, priests and monks and nuns that could staff and direct the schools, that all dried up. And so what happens is you have this movement from Catholic schools run by religious men and women to Catholic schools that are now run by lay people. And there are all kinds of problems with that, because now we've got lay people who are husbands and wives and fathers and mothers who have families who are much more expensive, on and on and on. Just the practical problems of having a lay staffed Catholic school that's modeled after the public school, the practical problems are just innumerable. And so the Catholic school system, instead of becoming a parallel that ran alongside the public school system and offered a Catholic alternative, became a private school system that offered a public school education. And with that, it just lost all of its attractiveness. Because the public school is already offering this Americanizing workplace readiness education for free. And for taxpayers, they're already paying into it. Like us today, if you're a homeschooling parent, you're paying property taxes in America that go to your public schools. And so not only are you already paying for the public school, but it costs you nothing to send your children there. And then when you turn and look at a Catholic school and you see that The Catholic school is modeled after the public school, offers a very similar curriculum with less resources, often inferior teachers as far as education and credentials are concerned, inferior facilities, and on top of that, an expensive you just see there's nothing attractive about it. Unless you're just so committed to having the name Catholic on your children's school, there's just nothing to attract you to the modern Catholic school. And so when those circumstances changed, the Catholic school system, with all of its initial momentum and growth, died. And we can see this in statistics. You can see this if you Google CARA, Church Statistics. You may find a website hosted by Georgetown University that has tons of statistics on Catholic population in America and internationally. But one of the things you can look at is statistics related to the Catholic schools. Enrollment numbers, the numbers of schools, the numbers of students at all different levels, and so on. And you can see that the Catholic school system just rose and rose and rose until around 1960, and then it just starts to decline. There are half the number of students in Catholic schools today in America than there were in 1960. So as the American population has continued to grow, the number of students in Catholic schools is half of what it was. And so the society in general is much less under the influence of Catholic schooling than it was in the 1960s. And we can see this. We can see this very simply by looking back at the culture, popular culture. In the 1930s and 1940s, 1950s, we see things like Catholic movies. We can look back and see, for example, Bing Crosby movies like The Bells of St. Mary's and other films, where you can just see the popular Catholic culture and how common Catholicism was in American society. You can see someone like Archbishop Fulton Sheen with a TV show on, like a primetime TV show on NBC in New York City. You can see how Catholic culture was a part of American public culture, popular culture. And then when you come to today, you see none of that. There's no Catholicism in popular culture. If you see Catholicism in a movie today or a TV show, it's a caricature of this sort of medieval, corrupt, secretive society that just shows that the people making the movies have no connection to Catholicism. Catholicism is separate from popular American culture. And you can see how different that was in the early to mid 1900s. So that Catholic school culture died when immigration slowed. And so, you're going to have the trad Catholic people say, "Oh, it was the Second Vatican Council that caused these." No, that's just ignorant. It's historically ignorant to say that. There were real changes that affected these things. There was a cutting off of a flood of Catholic men, women, and children from Catholic countries into America that took place when immigration was restricted. It's not some conspiracy theory, not some infiltration, all this foolishness. There was a real historical change that took place that cut off the supply of faculty members for Catholic schools. And when that happened, the Catholic parochial school system, as it was organized, died. And since then, it's just been kept alive. It's just been kept alive. It doesn't have any of its original mission, any of its original influence, and so on. It's an expensive public school with private school tuition, which is just the worst of both worlds. So that's what happened to the Catholic school system. And that's what continues to go on in both public and Catholic schools. You've got this Americanizing, workplace preparing educational program that's administered to millions and millions of children. And there's all kinds of problems because our society has evolved. It continues to develop. It's modernized. It's high-tech now. It's wireless now. There's remote working now. And we've got these big, old 19th, early 20th century institutions educating the kids for a society that doesn't even work that way anymore. And so the problems in modern education, sure, they're philosophical, but these schools were never intended to be philosophy schools. They're theological, but these schools were never designed to be theological schools. Most importantly, the problems in modern schools are practical. They're structural. Practical problems are the greatest obstacles in modern education. And there's just no way around it. There's just no way around it. It's like, the saying, moving, chairs around on the Titanic. That's what schools do when they talk about how they differ from the other schools and they're changing this and reforming this. If you look, the actual problem, which is the system itself, the structure of the school itself, this grade level, big, bulky, low standard, expensive school model that serves an unnatural goal, which is to give every citizen an education. It's just not sustainable without some kind of artificial support system like taxation. It's just not sustainable. And for the Catholic schools, which are offering that education without taxation, you've just got this tuition problem, which ends up leaving the Catholic school filled with students who aren't even Catholics. And then the school, being dependent on non-Catholics for its tuition, has to constantly water down and remove Catholic elements from the school so it doesn't offend its tuition-paying members. And again, you just end up with the most pointless of schools. So when we talk about school reform, it's not about changing the books in the Catholic school. It's not about adding Latin to the Catholic schools. It's not about having more history or literature studies or having a great books program in the public school. The whole entire school itself is the problem. The structure of the school itself is the problem. So we can't just move chairs around, redecorate these rooms on the Titanic. The whole entire ship is the problem. And so school reform is not a matter of curriculum change. It's not a matter of employing the Socratic method and all this ignorant nonsense that's talked about. The whole system is obsolete. It no longer makes any sense. It hasn't made sense for 50, 60 years. And we're just still perpetuating this, and we're perpetuating it for one simple reason. It makes money for lots of adults. The only reason the modern school system is being preserved is because it's a giant employment system for adults, for superintendents, principals, vice principals, guidance counselors, teachers, teaching assistants, coaches, lunch ladies, janitors, on and on and on. It's a massive industry that employs tons of adults. That's the good of this modern school system, is that it makes lots of adults money. And American people are just used to it. They just take it as granted that you need to spend $10,000 a year for your kid to go to the Catholic second grade program. They're just used to the numbers. They're used to the standards. They're used to having to empty their finances to have their kids go to a Catholic school. They're just used to that. They accept it as normal. And so when someone starts a new school and says, hey, this is a new Catholic school, and they set the tuition to be comparable to the other Catholic school tuitions, everyone just acts like that's the way it has to be. That's just normal. And it's just a total ripoff. It's a system that's obsolete, that no longer has anything to do with learning in the 21st century, but is entirely designed to give jobs to adults. That's what it does. There's going to be a principal who gets paid a nice salary. There's going to be maybe a vice principal, some other administrators, some secretaries will have jobs, and then we'll have the teachers, and we'll have all kinds of other supporting personnel in the school with jobs, part-time jobs, full-time jobs. And that's what the school is actually designed for. It's not designed for the students. It's not designed for learning. It's not designed to serve any actual Christian objectives in education. It's not designed for success even in the modern marketplace. It exists for the sake of the people who are employed by the school. It's a business, plain and simple. And like I said, Catholic parents, being ignorant of education and the goals of education or the history of education, they just accept this as the way it is. And it all gets perpetuated generation after generation, even though it's been dead, like I said, since the 1950s and 1960s. It just gets perpetuated. When we look at modern culture, we see, for example, that we have wireless internet communication. We have access to incomprehensible resources for learning, from libraries like Google Books or archive.org to paid resources like the Loeb Classical Library, the Oxford Dictionaries, and so on. All of the publishers have digital versions of all of their resources available for fractions of the cost of printed books. You've got the best teachers in the world accessible through the internet with videos and teaching series and all of this. You've got direct access to the market through the internet, direct access to customers and clients, where there's no more division where you need to get yourself into an office or a retail location on Main Street in order to do business, or you've got to get an advertisement into the local newspaper to get work. That old way of business is obsolete and doesn't even work like that anymore. And despite all of that, despite the universal access to learning resources and study materials, largely for free, despite direct access to the market from your own living room, the schools are, as it were, covering the eyes and ears of children and parents and not allowing them to see an alternative that just eliminates this big, old, expensive, useless school system. And the reason why they do this, again, is because A, they have jobs by perpetuating that old system, but B, they don't have the knowledge of the theology or the philosophy or the practical means of actually creating an effective system in modern society. They are not the people to do it. They don't actually have the expertise in educational administration and management to create solutions. They're like doctors who can't actually diagnose problems or provide remedies. And you wonder, why would you possibly pay a doctor who couldn't diagnose the causes of your illnesses or treat them? And that's exactly the question we should be asking. Why are we continuing to support these institutions that don't work, that aren't even relevant anymore? Why should we be paying people to serve as administrators and principals and teachers who actually are not innovative, intelligent, prudent educators in the 21st century? And the answer is we shouldn't be supporting these people. We shouldn't be supporting this hireling culture, this parasite culture that just sucks all of the resources out of the Christian community for no benefit to the students. So when we look at the real challenge of educational reform, it's not this nonsense that homeschool families do where they argue about which spelling book or which reading book or which math program they're going to use. It's not about adding a great books class to your sinking Titanic school. The questions are much more profound than that. The issues and needs are much deeper than that. And unless we get to those real issues, we're just moving furniture around. And we're doing so at such great costs, families paying thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars in school tuition and on books and all kinds of resources that accomplish relatively nothing. And that's the problem. And if you want red flags to look at the vocations crisis. These classical Catholic schools, homeschooling in general, Catholic schools, they have no success in raising students for religious vocations. Now, you can accept the message that they will tell you. They will just blame it on God. They'll say, well, I guess even though we're awesome and everything we do is great, I guess God is just not calling people to religious vocations. Oh, well, it's not our fault. God is just not calling people. But the problem with that is God has already called men and women to religious life. The bishops are constantly calling men and women to religious vocations. The church is praying for religious vocations. So this whole idea that God is not calling people to religious vocations is contradicted by the actual behavior of the church. The church is calling for religious vocations. And so this attempt to like spiritualize the problem is just sophistry. Schools are supposed to be leading students to religious vocations. Schools are supposed to be cultivating religious vocations. Schools are supposed to be introducing students to contemplation, to contemplative life, that they simply continue in religious vocations. Again, if we go back to Thomas Aquinas and we say, well, what kind of school did Thomas Aquinas go to? We're already wrong. Thomas Aquinas was raised in a Benedictine monastery. Thomas Aquinas was immersed in the actual religious life of the church when he was 5 years old. He was raised in a monastic community where the divine office was the ordering event of the day, all through the day. He wasn't raised in a secular environment where they threw in a faith formation class. Now, why would we be pretending that these modern methods are reasonable when we can go look at history and see that it's not how things worked? It just doesn't make any sense. I think we're afraid to cut our losses with modern education. We're afraid to close all these schools down because, again, we've got all of these hirelings employed by these schools making millions and millions of dollars throughout the country. We've got all of these families, lay families, dependent on faculty salaries, which are unsustainable. And we're afraid to upset that. So we just allow it to perpetuate, even though everyone knows it's ineffective. It's been ineffective for 60 plus years. Everyone knows that. But it's perpetuated because changing it would just not be convenient for everyone. And so you can have this fake classical education movement that comes along and says, hey, we're gonna change education. We're going to make Catholic education great again. And the way we're going to do it is by basically lying about what education was like in the past, maintaining all of the failing systems of the present, and just redecorating them and saying, there, now we've got old-fashioned Catholic education. And it's just a total con man job. It's a total scam. They're simply making the thing that's failing look different in some external, accidental qualities, and telling parents that it is actually now restored to what it was before. And it's just a lie. It's historically false. It's still a Catholic school modeled on public schooling without a supply of religious teachers, without funding that's necessary, aimed at goals that are not worthy of Catholic education, and it just will not work. It's sure, when you create a new school, there's going to be initial, excitement about this new opportunity. They're going to imagine that because it's different, it's actually going to change things, but it doesn't change things. And we can point to results and say, oh, well, that's not true. Our school, Holy Saints Academy here, we started with a quote unquote classical curriculum, which is just total nonsense, using the Socratic method, which is just total nonsense. And we've already seen results. Oh yeah, what kind of results? Well, our average SAT score is 80 points higher than the average public school score. Okay. The average public school score includes the scores of kids whose parents are drug addicts, kids who don't even have fathers. So you're taking the average scores of the public school, which opens its doors to any kid that walks in off the street, and you're going to say that because you're getting higher scores than those schools, that it's proof that you've restored real Christian education and have reformed education, when in fact you've reformed nothing. You've simply drawn a small portion of the community into a private school and have magically obtained higher scores than the public school system, which is a welfare program. And you're pretending that that is the sign of restoration of Christian education, where the actual sign of restoration of Christian education would be objective matters of curriculum and structure, not relative outcomes. We can go back in history and understand what the philosophy of education was for Catholic people. We can understand what the necessary curriculum is based on Catholic teaching. We can go back as recently as the 1900s and read popes articulating the need to promote scholastic theology and scholastic philosophy in schools. And when we look at the Catholic school, or we look at the so-called classical Catholic school, and we see that it has nothing to do with the history or philosophy or true objectives of Catholic education, but it simply is a freshly repainted public school program decorated with Catholic pictures, we have to call scam, because that's what it is. Now, to bring this talk to an end here, let me just talk positively. When you look at the Classical Liberal Arts Academy and what we're doing in the Academy, what you'll see is we're actually addressing the problems in modern Catholic education. And the number one problem is the big, wasteful, expensive school system that accomplishes nothing for anyone other than providing daycare and extracurricular activities. Academically, it's useless and obsolete. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we're looking at modern educational opportunities and resources. We're looking at the modern market, the modern workplace, religious vocations in modern society, and we're asking, if that is the end goal, and we're here at point A, that's point B, what do we need to do to connect point A to point B in a new way, in the most efficient way possible, the most productive way possible? That's the mission of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. So we're taking away this idea of school as a source of employment. No, school has no obligation to provide income to adults in a community. That's not the responsibility of any school. The only responsibility of a school is to educate children. That's the purpose of a school. It's not to be a source of employment for adults. And I get messages daily from Catholics asking me if there are any jobs available. Any jobs. They've never studied our curriculum. They have no idea what we even teach. They have no idea of the mission of our program. They take no time to even look into any of that. They just see a Catholic educational institution that they've never heard of before, and the first thing they do is send their resume asking if there's any jobs. Because, again, in modern society, that's what Catholic schools are. They're just places for people to get jobs. That's what they are. We get it all the time. The Catholic school has no obligation to provide work for any adults. The responsibility of a Catholic school is to educate children, to teach the Catholic faith, to teach Catholic philosophy, to teach the classical liberal arts as all the doctors and fathers of the Church understood and taught themselves. These are the only obligations of a Catholic school program, to teach the Catholic faith, to initiate children into the Catholic life. As far as preparation for future vocations is concerned, the chief and greatest, most excellent vocation is religious vocation, and therefore Catholic schools have to initiate children into contemplation. They've got to introduce them to philosophical questions, philosophical studies, theological studies. They've got to introduce them to Catholic devotions and sacramental life. They've got to catechize Catholic children. Not just catechize them with the content of the faith, which is the first part of the catechism, but the entire catechism. The sacramental life, the moral life, Catholic prayer, and so on. And so these challenges that the Catholic school has, modern Catholic schools don't even touch them. We've got to make education as affordable as possible. If we can offer a free Catholic education, we should. If it costs $20 a month, then that's what it should cost. We should be working to find the most efficient, most affordable means of accomplishing the ends of Catholic education that are available to us today. And if we're not doing that, we have to answer the question, who are we actually serving? Are we actually serving the children in these schools? Are we actually serving parents with children who need Catholic education? And it's partly their fault as well, because their ignorance can't be excused as it could 100 years ago. They have access to all the same resources in their own home that any school would. So there's a lot of accountability now for parents to take direct responsibility and say, look, it's not like the school library is the only place where the kids can access books, or the school which has all the textbooks. This stuff is all online in my living room now. So there's no more excuse. There's no more blame shifting. You can't just push accountability off onto the parish or the school when you've got access to everything directly from your own home. And again, this is what Catholics need to be taught. There's no more school responsible for the education of your children. You have access to all the resources at home. You know, the internet isn't just a source of TV shows and sports or your favorite news show. It's also a source of endless educational resources that you can no longer ignore without some moral culpability. And so the reform of Catholic education means organizing Catholic education that makes sense in the 21st century. Not just copying and pasting a school from the 1960s, changing the curriculum and giving it some fancy name and sticking uniforms on kids and saying, there, now we've reformed, we've restored Catholic. No, that's not Catholic education. That's public school American education that you've simply perpetuated for no reason other than the benefits that it offers to the people actually running the school. The reform of education in the 21st century means making organized use of all of the new resources available to families, to students, and being willing to do so at the lowest possible cost, even if that means working yourself out of a job. The school has no obligation to employ adults. The school exists to educate children, and it should do so in the most efficient, the most sustainable way possible. That's real school reform. Now, in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, that's what we're doing. Now, for example, we just got the Academy accredited, and we did so without raising any of our costs $1 to any parents. All of the costs of accreditation, we ate those costs ourselves. That's how schools should work. We never asked parents to donate. We didn't make parents pay the cost of our tuition, of our accreditation fees. When we make improvements, we just offered the Loeb Classical Library freely to all of our students. We didn't have a fundraiser and make anyone pay for that first. We paid for that because we're the ones taking responsibility to improve and reform Catholic education. It's our mission. It's our job. It's not for us to receive from the Christian community. It's our responsibility, our mission to give to the Catholic community. That's school reform. That's school reform. No more of this exploitation of Catholic parents stuck in difficult circumstances with secular schools or Protestantized schools and exploiting their need for Catholic education by making them impoverish their family to send their kid to some obsolete school that's offering an education that doesn't even make any sense in the 21st century and that isn't producing religious vocations or any contemplative vocations of any kind. That's just exploitation. It's like price gouging during a time of a natural disaster. You've got people who are vulnerable, and instead of being helped by wise, generous servants, they're actually being taken advantage of because their circumstances are so desperate and because they're ignorant and negligent. Rather than helping them out of that ignorance and challenging them to overcome that negligence, those things are kept in place because you can make money off them. And so this fake alternative is presented for the financial benefit of those presenting it, with no benefit or relatively no benefit to the students in the long run. They end up with an education that they can boast that they got a higher SAT score than the public school kids, which should embarrass us to even say things like that. It's like my kids bragging, or me as a father bragging, that my kids don't get abused by a drunken father because I'm a Christian. And so the decreased number of abuse cases is proof that Christian fathers are great. Like, who would make that argument? But that's the argument that's being made in education. Because our kids in Catholic schools don't suffer all of the evils of kids in public secular schools, the Catholic schools must be great. That's totally false. And it's especially false when there's claims that we're actually restoring classical, historical education, talking about saints and doctors of the church who would have nothing to do with these modern schools, wouldn't even know what they're for or what they're doing or why they exist, because they don't even teach the curriculum that was identified as the Catholic school curriculum throughout church history. So again, to wrap this up, when we talk about school reform, we've got to first identify the problems, which are fundamental. They're practical, structural problems. And then we've got to actually develop solutions to those problems. That's what school reform really means. And I really don't know where that's being done outside of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And for us, it's just going to get better and better over time, because as long as these other programs don't actually address the problems, they're all going to fail. Whereas we're going to rise and actually have solutions that give our students advantages over time. And as I announced recently, we're moving now from academy level work into college level work. And we're just going to keep going. And eventually the modern colleges and schools are just going to be impossible to afford, just completely unsustainable. And there's just going to be no other option except for the real solution. So that's the real problem with schools. This is the real work of school reform. And again, it's why if you're still talking about this modern nonsense, this fake classical education, I just don't have any answer for you. You know, you're not asking the question, what is the actual cause of the problem, and do I have a solution? You're just moving furniture around. Again, on the Titanic as it sinks, knowing it's sinking, seeing it sinking on all sides, and just continuing to do things that don't change that reality, that have no effect on the cause of the problem. And so, anyway, I hope that's helpful. That's my response to any questions about what other groups are doing. If they're not addressing the problems, I don't know what they're doing or why they're doing it or why parents are supporting it, because it's not going to help. We're going to end up with the same outcomes, same problems, and next generation, it's all going to be exactly the same, if not worse. So anyway, that's what we should focus on in true reform, practical solutions to practical problems, and not allow this to be spiritualized or to have con men selling us new furniture or offering to repaint the room as the whole ship sinks. I hope that's helpful. God bless.